Greetings and happy new academic year. I am Mohammed Tawakkoli, the inaugural director of the Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies at the University of Toronto. I welcome you to the second annual Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali Distinguished Lecturer Series. The series began last year with an inaugural lecture by the late Iraj Pezeshkzad and continues this year with an inspiring presentation by our brilliant colleague, Professor Farzaneh Milani. As you all know, Farzaneh Milani is the Raymond Nelson Professor of Iranian Studies, Iranian Literature and Gender Studies at the University of Virginia. She is the former chair of the Department of Middle Eastern and South Asian Languages and Culture and past director of Women, Gender and Sexuality Studies and Middle East Studies programs. Milani has published several books and articles in Persian and English. She has written for the New York Times, Washington Post, Christian Science Monitor, Miss Magazine, Reader's Digest, International, and USA Today, among others. She has presented more than 270 lectures nationally and internationally. A past president of the Association for Middle Eastern Women's Studies and a Carnegie Fellow, Milani was the recipient of the All University Teaching Award 1999, Zintl Leadership Award 2015, and Cavaliers Distinguished Teaching Award and Professorship in 2020. Last year, the Nobel Committee of the Swedish Academy invited Professor Milani to join it as a member of its board of external experts for literature. Milani will serve in this capacity for 3 years. Before inviting Professor Milani to speak, I would like to express our collective gratitude to Canada's Indigenous people and acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of Credit River. Today, this meeting place continues to be the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to teach and learn on their ancestral homeland. Please join me to welcome Professor Milani to the University of Toronto. Professor Milani.
Thank you, Mohammed Jan. It is truly an honor. I can't tell you how wonderful it is to see such wonderful friends and colleagues, even if it's virtually. I'm really sorry we couldn't get together in person, but hopefully somewhere in a corner of this big yet also very small universe that we live in. I had prepared a written presentation, which my dear friend and colleague Mohammed Tawakkoli has, and I was going to read it to you. But all morning, I was thinking, gee, I had never done something similar. I have never talked about myself. I have never talked about my literary career. And when Mohammed Jan asked me to do that, he, I hope, remembers, I was very reluctant. And I kept saying, no, but why? Just, you know, the typical Iranian ta'aruf, and why should I do that? Let me talk about this and that. Anyway, so as a compromise, instead of talking only about my life, we'll be talking about my literary career, which of course is not separate from my life. So if it's okay with you, I'm not going to read the presentation that I've worked so hard to prepare. I will refer to it. I will occasionally look at it and perhaps read sections of it to you. But I would like this to be a more intimate conversation with you. This is an intimate topic for me, and I would like it to be an intimate presentation. So, of course, I'm honored to be here. As we all know, and as I have been writing about it for almost 40-some years, it has not been easy for Iranians to talk about themselves originally. And now, of course, if anything, we should call this period the era of life narratives among Iranians. Everybody, thankfully, is writing biography, autobiography, memoir, travel narrative, and a whole variety of subgenres in the literary category of life narratives. One of the perks of being old is, of course, the right, the privilege to have a hindsight view, to have a retrospective view. And as we all know, hindsight is always 20/20 and often very self-serving. So I would like to begin my presentation with this warning that this is a hindsight view. And although I have tried not to make it very self-serving, but that ultimately it will be. I want to begin with a poem that I love, that I have read over and over. And it's only after I started working on my Threshold project that I saw something completely different in it. Of course, this is a poem by the master T.S. Eliot. And I want to read just a few lines of it. It's from the fourth quartet, from the four quartets. It's the section Little Kidding, and the last one, section 5. What we call the beginning is often the end. And to make an end is to make a beginning. The end is where we start from. With the drawing of this love and the voice of this calling, we shall not cease from exploration. And the end of our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. So please let me begin where it all began for me. As the Bible reminds us, in the beginning was the Word. And words, at least intelligible words, came rather late to me in life. When I finally did speak, it was a mumbo jumbo sort of a language. I think a combination of Persian and Gilaki, the two languages that I was exposed to at home. At the time, which is decades ago, it was believed in Iran that quail eggs helped children who had difficulty speaking. So my sweet grandfather brought me those tiny little eggs in the folds of his turban. And I'm gonna allow myself to be indulged and read to you today a couple of my own poems. This is one. The scene is etched on my mind and on my life. The doorbell rings, and in anticipation of my grandfather's visit, I run to the door. My 3-year-old hands cannot reach the knob. I jump and jump again. The door does not budge. I must wait for a grown-up to save me. And as I see my grandfather enter, I hide in the welcoming folds of his brown abaya. I hold on to his foot to stop the world. And the world stops. Later, much later, a lifetime of a cherished memory later, he bends down and gently, ever so gently, invites me out of my fortress. I throw open the gates of my eyes as my grandfather reaches in the folds of his black turban, his magician's box, and produces not a bird, but a bird's egg. Key to my locked tongue. Treasure in my treasury, in my memory trove. The quail eggs work their magic, but only too well. Once I started talking, I could barely stop. My mother blamed the quail eggs. Yet, in her distinctively loving, but also firm fashion, she kept reminding me that we are given 2 ears and 1 mouth for a good reason. I'm not sure I have followed my mother's wise counsel, but surely an enduring love of words and the genuine faith in magic and mystery was instilled in me from early childhood. I believe most Iranians share my love of words. We Iranians grow up kissing books. We go to the pilgrimage, not only to the shrine of saints, but also to our revered literary figures. Most of us, including myself, as you just witnessed, we dabble in poetry. But alas, rulers and dictators also know the power of words and the love of Iranians for words. So admittedly and regrettably, fear of the written word is almost as old as Iranian literature itself. Writers have been intimidated, abducted, imprisoned, put under house or country arrest, exiled, executed, denied proper burial. They had their property confiscated, their lips sewn together, their tongues cut out, their fingers broken, their mutilated bodies hung in public places. A whole category of Persian literature is devoted to such atrocities, reserved for people who are in command of words and wield the pen. In the words of Bakhtash Abtin, and I'm sure you've heard about his unfortunate death at the age of 48, when he was put in the overcrowded prison of Evin, he caught COVID, and when he was taken to hospital in chains, he eventually passed away. Bakhtash tells us, or rather reminds us, that in a country like Iran, death is very cheap for intellectuals, freedom-loving people, and those who fight for freedom of expression. We are not worried to face trials, to go to prison, to endure suffering. Again, to repeat, it's a loss that Mr. Bakhtash lost his life that could have been avoided at the age of 48. Although literature is sacred in Iran, it might surprise you to know, or perhaps you already know, that according to the Freedom to Write Index in 2021, the top 10 offenders are China, Saudi Arabia, Myanmar, and then Iran, the land of the rose and the nightingale. When it comes to freedom of expression, things are not much better. In fact, if anything, they're getting worse. Again, the top 10 offenders are North Korea, Eritrea, and Iran. In 2021, we were number 174. This year, we now have 178 as our shameful rating among 180 countries in the world that were studied. In a recent interview, Mahsa Mohibbali, whose writing I really enjoy, a writer inside Iran, said something really interesting. She said, if you're a writer in Iran, you have made two mistakes. Being a woman is the first, being a writer is the second. Mohibbali has a point. Being a writer, as we just came to see some examples, has been exalted in Iran, for sure, but it has also been perilous and hazardous, and doubly so for women. It is exactly this desire to understand the obstacles that Iranian women writers and poets confronted in their writings, in fully realizing their potentials as writers. That has been the central, and I have to admit, perhaps the only concern of my writing. But again, let me go back and begin with another turning point. I left Iran on December 7, December 17, 1967. You might be interested to know that the first entry in my diary after my arrival in the United States at a rather early age was this observation that there are no walls around the houses here. Now, my views on walls have evolved over the years. I'm now aware of visible and invisible walls. I now better understand the protecting and restricting, the uniting and the dividing nature of walls. I'm also now aware of invisible veils, the ones that cloud minds, that cloak words, that envelop truth, that fight openness. I'm now aware that the total lack of walls, veils, and borders is an illusion that refuses to be called what it is, an illusion. Now, leaving Iran in 1967 also made me aware of my identity as an Iranian. It is no exaggeration to say that I became Iranian after I left Iran, or at least that I became aware of my Iranian identity when I left Iran. When I was in Iran, I never had to introduce myself as an Iranian. It was as clear as the oxygen in the air. After arrival, I switched major. I had studied dentistry in Iran. When I came to the US, I switched to French literature, French being one of, other than Persian, the other language that I was also exposed to as a child, and I went to a French school for 12 years. So conveniently, I wanted to graduate in French literature. But then when I realized that I could switch major, I did once again, and I have to say I became a butt of joke. Everybody said that she will never graduate. As soon as she's close to the finishing line, she's going to switch major and go from dentistry to French literature and now to complete, and God knows what's going to be next. But I did. I switched to comparative literature. Mainly, I have to say, because I wanted to write my dissertation on Furugh Farrokhzad. Now, many well-wishers, including some of my own professors, thought that that was not a wise decision. They argued with concern, and I was sure it was concern for me, that an Iranian woman writing her dissertation on another Iranian woman, and that from a feminist perspective, was a triple, I remember somebody used that, said it's a triple professional suicide. More than 4.5 decades later, I consider that choice a turning point in my life. Now, you might be surprised that my introduction to Furugh Farrokhzad was actually not through her poetry. I was mesmerized. I was stunned into silence by her movie, the short 22 minutes documentary, The House is Back. I vividly recall the scene. The smell of jasmine everywhere. The stars in the beautiful sky of Tehran in those days, close at hand. And suddenly, I saw the disfigured portraits of men and women who were afflicted by leprosy on the television screen. I could barely see at those images, but I also could not take my eyes away. I was mesmerized by the film, and I absolutely loved the melodious voice over of Forough Farrokhzad, who amazingly was only reading borrowed verses from the Bible. Every single line of Forough Farrokhzad in that poetry, in that movie, are verses borrowed from the Bible. From then on, Farrokhzad became a lifetime companion. She became a permanent fixture in my scholarly life. I remember my husband used to joke that I married one woman and two women moved in, Farzaneh Milani and Forough Farrokhzad. In the 1970s, when I was writing my dissertation on Forough Farrokhzad's biography, my original intention, there were no biographies of any Iranian women available. Not that there was no biography on Forough. To the best of my knowledge, there were no biography of any Iranian women. But I had somehow convinced myself that finding biographical data on this most autobiographical poet of contemporary Iran, and honestly, I think of all of Iran, would not be difficult. After all, she said it all in her own poetry, even in her film, which I consider to be an autobiographical film in more ways than one. I could hardly have been more wrong. My plan of amassing information through interviews or archival research was thwarted at every turn. Many men who claimed to be Farrokhzad's lover were all too eager to share their experience with her. But her family, her colleagues, her close friends, and the man who was the lover of her life for the last 8 years of her life, Mr. Golestan, simply refused to even meet with me. Others who met with me asked me with surprise, but why reveal the life of a dead person? In my biography at the time, I wanted to be factual. I wanted to be informative without being sensational about a life that had been turned into a sensational story. I wanted to steer clear of tattletales, innuendos, gossips, gossip about gossip. I wanted to be revealing, but not voyeuristic. I wanted to be coherent, but not univocal. I wanted to be candid as much as I could without being judgmental. Also, as a feminist, I wanted to avoid turning Farzaneh's life into a metaphor for gender or even political agendas. I wanted her biography to offer a polycentric perspective. I wanted it to be the portrait of a wife, of a daughter, of a mother, of a biological mother and adoptive mother, of a poet, of a cinematographer, of an Iranian woman that I thought at the time, and even today, is of universal appeal and relevance. I was quite disappointed with the result of my research and my interviews. So I turned my dissertation into a critical analysis of Farzaneh's poetry. And now, I think, again, with the benefit of hindsight, I think it was, in a way, a disguised form of autobiography. For this presentation, I went back and I read my dissertation. And I saw, my God, there is so much of me in that dissertation. So my dissertation was not a biography of Forough. It was titled Forough Farzaneh, a critical analysis from a feminist perspective. But I knew that I'm not ready to publish that dissertation as a book. So it took me 12 long years to publish my first book, Veils and Words, The Emerging Voices of Iranian Women Writers. Now, Veils and Words, and perhaps I will not be doing justice to it. I don't think it's that simple or simplistic. But the central thesis of Veils and Words was that the veil has not covered only women's bodies, but also women's literary voices. I began with the amazing life and poetry of Tahireh Qurratu'l-Ain, who had unveiled herself in 1848. And I want to repeat that date. I didn't say 1948. She unveiled herself in a public place in a gathering of 81 men in 1848. And I end the book with another Tahireh Safarzadeh, who revealed herself, who voluntarily adopted the veil in pre-revolutionary Iran. While I did not see the contradiction in the book, when I got to the chapter on Tahireh Safarzadeh, I conveniently argued that the veil now is no longer a sign and a symbol of segregation. That now a woman can be veiled, as Tahireh Safarzadeh had veiled herself voluntarily before the revolution, and had in fact become more popular, her poetry attracting more attention. I said, so now this veil is no longer a sign and symbol of segregation, but of desegregation. It did not occur to me then that if I'm using the veil as a paradigm for both segregation and desegregation, there might be something wrong here. And it took me quite a few years to come to the conclusion that it was not the veil. And I want to make it very clear that by the veil, I mean the voluntary adoption of veiling or unveiling. That was not the issue, but that at the core of lack of access of women to the public arena and to the literary scene, to the white page, was not being veiled or not veiled, but being segregated or desegregated. I started teaching a course at the time at the University of Virginia called Women's Beauty Cross-Culturally. And we're talking about 20, 30 years ago. And it was a fascinating journey for me. I soon realized that it wasn't only Iran or Iranian literature that idealized, immobilized women and silent women, women who kept in their private spaces, in their designated spaces. I started from foot binding in China, and I soon realized that there are lots of examples in other parts of the world. I soon realized that sleeping beauties, silent women, imprisoned women were lauded, whereas the counter-ideal woman was one who was in move. Consider the example, of course, of the flying witch, the witch being the counter-ideal woman. All of these and a number of other courses and students helped me better understand that indeed freedom of movement has been the prerogative of men. Look at some of the heroes, especially of the modern era. And of course, I want to remind you of Michel Foucault's book on prison, and how he argues that it was with modernity that denying people their freedom of movement became the ultimate form of punishment. But look, Don Quixote cannot be imagined without his donkey, or Odysseus is always associated with his trips, with going places. And of course, our own Rostam. We cannot imagine Rostam without his beloved horse, Rash. So it became more and more clear to me that segregation and desegregation have at their core the issue of freedom of movement. And I love this quotation from Margaret Atwood, one of my absolute most favorite writers. This is an interview in the New York Times. She says there is probably a simple reason for this freedom of movement. Send a woman out alone on a rambling nocturnal quest, and she's likely to end up a lot deader, a lot sooner than a man would. And of course, we know that even to this day, that is the truth. Consider the Red Riding Hood. By the way, the poor Red Riding Hood never rode on anything. So why this Red Riding Hood? But wouldn't she have helped herself not confronting the bad wolf had she stayed on the clear path, on the designated space? So the central argument of veils, of words, not swords, is very simple. I take the statement of Virginia Woolf, again, someone who's had an incredible impact on my life and my writing and on my development as a literary critic. In her book, A Room of One's Own, as you recall, she says a woman needs a room of her own and economic independence to be able to become a writer. Well, I added to that, well, yes, of course, a woman needs both of those things. But in a country like Iran, for instance, women had both. In their segregated spaces, they had a room of their own, and they were granted economic independence, or some of it at least. But they still could not fully develop their potential as writers. And I argued the reason for that is that a room that does not allow a woman safe exit and safe entry is no different from a prison cell. You can expand that to a country as well. That led me to the beautiful gypsy poems of Simin Behbahani, a woman I love, like my mother. Simin Behbahani, as you might recall, has written 16 poems devoted in full to gypsies. And of course, gypsies, in her poetry, Obey's women, are known to be trespassers of borders. They're not respectful of boundaries. They don't remain in their proper space. And Simin Behbahani identified with the figure of the gypsy and wrote those beautiful poems for them. It's all, again, about freedom of movement and how silence and mobility are interconnected when it comes to better understanding the literature of women. Now, it's at this point that I went back to my project of Furugh Farrokhzad. This is a cup of sin. It's a selected poems of Furugh Farrokhzad. It's a book my dear friend and colleague Kafeh Safa and I translated. It only has 103 of more than 400 poems of Simin Behbahani. They were chosen with her help and blessing, and they were translated with her help and blessing. I don't think they are necessarily the solid English translation that they need to be, But I think in terms of the understanding of Simin Behbahani's poetry, which is not easy, they are as close as they can be, because I had the privilege to discuss every poem with her and every line and every word. So I returned to Forough Farrokhzad's biography after many decades. I continued to admire Forough, not because she was perfect or right all the time, or even admirable, but precisely because she was the first to admit she was flawed and fallible. She also knew the world she lives in is far from being a perfect place. And she wanted to make herself a better version of herself. And she wanted to make the world she lives in a better place to live in. There are a few things I loved about Farrokhzad. When I started learning more about her poetry, and I have already told you how I loved her film. One, I really love the way Farrokhzad takes full responsibility for her actions. Sure, she always wanted to have more freedom, but she never thought that freedom does not come with responsibility. And that, to me, is one of the gifts of Forough Farrokhzad to Iranian literature. These accepting full responsibility for her actions, knowing that she can change herself and turn herself into a different person, a better person, were fundamental to her life and to her poetry, as was the idea of motherhood. And I want to take a couple of minutes of your time and talk about that, because I don't think enough has been said about this struggle of Forough Farrokhzad. Farrokhzad wanted to be a biological mother, an adoptive mother, and an artist at the same time. And this should be a right granted to any woman who wants it. She was never granted that right. She suffered because of that forced separation with her son, Mr. Omidyar Shahpur. And I'm deeply saddened to say that her son, Omidyar Shahpur, was has equally suffered from separation from his mother. To this day, it is hard for me to read this poem, وهم سبز. تمام روز در آینه گریه می کردم. بهار پنجره‌ام را به وهم سبز درختان سپرده بود. تنم به پیله تنهاییم نمی کنجید. You know, outside world is all green and rejuvenation and rebirth. And this woman, this mother, has been assigned the role of an ex-mother, denied the rights and the privilege to visit with her one and only biological son till she died at the age of 32. Farzaneh was also a seeker after the truth, after beauty. In modern Persian literature, I cannot think of anyone else who has talked more about the significance of telling the truth, of how this truth-telling project is her duty, and how hearing the truth is her readers and her audiences' right. By the time I completed the biography of Farzaneh with unpublished letters, and I hope we'll have time to talk a little bit about the book, I had come to realize that her body of work, taken as a whole, in other words, if we don't cherry pick a line from a poem or a poem from a collection, her whole body of work is the coming together of extremes. It is, in a way, a synthesis of what we have come to perceive as binary opposites. That's when I started thinking about threshold space, this third space, this space of fluidity, this space that goes beyond binary opposites and allows us to see the world not as an either-or proposition, but as this and that. As a spectrum. The realization that a threshold holds a special place in the architecture of not only Farzaneh's poetry, and it does. There are references to Astane in all of her 5 poetry collections. And I think The House is Black is also made at the threshold of health and disease, of freedom and imprisonment, and a whole bunch of other binary opposites. That I realized it's not only her poetry or her work that has this primary significance given to threshold, but that in the architecture of the writing of many women, including the one I have already told you, Simin Behbahani, Simin Daneshvar, and many others, that you see the coming together of opposites. I was also fascinated to realize that some of the pioneering women writers in contemporary Iran, starting with Tahireh Qurratu'l-Ain, Amine Pakrawan, Iran Dokhte Teymurtash, Shams Kasma'i, Fatemeh Sayyah, Simin Daneshvar, Furugh Farrokhzad, Guli Taraqi, Mahshid Amirshahi, Ghazali Azizadeh, Shahrnush Parsipur have all had exposure to other countries, have gone beyond the borders of Iran in formative years in their literary careers. And something interesting happened at this point. I realized that thresholds also carry a personal significance to me. I started remembering childhood memories. And that's when I realized I started with the question, how interesting that Jewish families have a mezuzah attached to the frame of their houses. That's the point where it's both entry and exit. It's a fascinating space. It's a space for which we really don't have much of a vocabulary. Is it inside or is it outside? Is it safe or is it unsafe? In our culture, is it andaruni or biruni? And of course, it's both. And I realized that I have memories of my childhood and early youth in Iran, where every time I or either of my four brothers were going on a trip, we're going on an important meeting or something we were nervous about, my mother will come and stand at the threshold of the door and hold the Quran over our head. So if you would indulge me, I'm going to read you another poem that I wrote recently about my experience. And that is my mother superimposed on a beautiful picture of what I think is a lovely threshold. She stood there at the threshold, sacred book in hand, a goddess on her heavenly throne. She stood at the threshold, her arms a sturdy pillar holding up the sky, a celestial canopy, bridge over my missteps. Look, my mother is at the threshold of being and not being, of transience and permanence, both revealed and concealed. She stands a splendid sun, resting at the heart of a shadow. My mother is standing here at the threshold, a guiding light, a guardian angel. I don't think it's an exaggeration for me to claim that as a student in the last 50 years of Iranian women writers, to claim that the refusal to remain behind closed doors, excluded, unacknowledged, unseen, and unheard, runs like a unifying thread through the work of Iranian women writers. These women wanted to overcome absence and silence, and they simply could not stand behind closed doors. But they also had the wisdom to recognize that in order to enjoy the outing, you need to have a safe home to go to. I have to admit, before learning feminist literary criticism, or even intersectional criticism. I learned them from Iranian women, in particular Iranian women writers. This journey, from when I started to this day, I have to admit, has been a lonely and at times tumultuous journey. But literature in general, and Iranian literature in particular, has offered me shelter and refuge. It has taken me to places in which I have left my childhood behind, places that continue to be with me in my dreams. They continue to be the setting of my earliest and most profound memories, a place in which my parents and my ancestors are buried. And this country, this portable home, this surrogate land, has never refused me safe entry and safe exit. To the contrary, it has become my perennial garden. I have put down roots in it. I have turned it into a place to grow in, to find my voice in, to plant my ideas in. And every time I stand at its threshold, every time I open its gate, a familiar scent wafts out of it, a scent of home, a scent of effortless belonging, a scent of jasmine mixed with childhood memories, a scent of borderless humanity and generous hospitality. And my friends, it is sweet. It is very sweet to have a portable home, a home no one can take away from me, a home that is mine to keep, a home I can go to and I can leave as I wish. Salman Rushdie tells us that the books and stories we fell in love with make us who we are. Or, not to claim too much, the beloved tale becomes a part of the way in which we understand things and make judgments and choices in our daily lives. Well, I hope I have been changed by the books I have loved and by this long literary journey. I hope I see the world, myself and others, with a pair of new eyes, that I challenge what I took for granted before because of habit, convention, or expectation. I hope these books and this journey have helped me dust off the mirror of my soul, that they have opened the gates of my heart and mind to curiosity and compassion, to fresh air and to higher ideals. I hope they have helped me remain a seeker after truth, after love, and after justice and peace for all. I warned you at the beginning about the efficacy of the quail eggs. And I can hear a gentle and familiar voice is whispering in my ears that it is time to say goodbye and to stop. So allow me to end with how we begin our stories. Yeki bud, yeki nabud. There was one and there wasn't one. A sentence at the threshold of every story. A sentence in which the creator becomes the creator. For thousands of years, Iranian storytellers have begun their stories with this enigmatic sentence. There was one, and there wasn't one. Abracadabra. Now you see it, now you don't. It is so, and it is not so. Perhaps Yeki bud, yeki nabud is also a reminder that there is always another story, there is another side to the story. But for me, perhaps most importantly, it is a reminder that behind every storyteller stand several other people. That might be the reason some of the most exquisite expression of Iranian art do not carry the name of a single artist. I believe there is great wisdom in that. We need to acknowledge the collective and collaborative nature of any achievement, no matter how humble. So I know if it wasn't for all the debts of gratitude I have accumulated over the years, if it wasn't for the support, the mentoring and the guidance of family and friends, of teachers and scholars, of colleagues, students, and kind, hospitable audiences like you, I would have a different story to tell and a different path to take. So thank you for taking the time to listen to me. Thank you for being so patient. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Professor Milani, for your thoughtful and inspiring presentation, and thank you for taking us to this intellectual journey. I'm confident that there are a lot of questions and queries. Anyone?
Please don't put anybody on the spot.
Okay. I put myself on the spot.
Yes.
Going from your first book, Veils and Words, to Words, Not Swords, do you think your historical perspective has changed? Did you experience the kind of foundational shift in your analytical approach?
Yes, I did. First of all, I realized that I cannot talk about any of the subjects that are of interest to me in those books and in everything I've done in the last 50 years. Access to voice, visibility, mobility, and the rest of it, without contextualizing it in their historic setting. Margaret Atwood, in her brilliant book, The Handmaid's Tale, repeats a few times, context is everything. And I would add to that, that neither of these subjects can be talked about without the historic context, without the cultural context, and without a better understanding of how these terms, how these institutions, how these practices were practiced, were perceived, were understood in their time. That was number one. But more importantly, I realized that although veiling, the institution of veiling is very important, and you know, in every book that I've written, I have started it with Tahireh Qurratul Ain, because I think the fact that she unveiled herself in Badasht in 1848 was a moment that we cannot forget when we talk about modernity in Iran, when we talk about the rights of the individual in Iran, when we talk about choice in Iran, and when we talk about the issue of freedom of religion, freedom of expression, and desegregation. But I want to emphasize that I also believe it's the right of a woman to choose. So that's how I thought, well, veiling and unveiling, taken out of some context, not in every period, can be a choice of clothing. For Tahireh Qurratul Ain, it was a sign and a symbol of desegregation. Tahireh Qurratul Ain was fighting for equal rights for women. But if we take that into consideration, at the core of segregation and desegregation is the issue of freedom of movement. Patriarchal societies in general and Muslim societies, not from the beginning, but at a certain point when they started becoming more and more closed in, denied women their freedom of movement. And this segregation, some women see it as a form of imprisonment. What Foucault sees as the beginning of modernity. And let us not forget that the first veiled Muslim women does not appear in Western literature before Don Quixote. It is only in that book that we see the veil become the sine qua non of Muslim women. Prior to that, we had a diverse group of Muslim women. In fact, I would argue that the majority of them were larger than life. So I think for me, it became a paradigm shift that I can't focus on the veil. I should focus on segregation. And it has been such a journey because I think you can also not talk about segregation, racial segregation, without the issue of mobility at its very core and center.
Thank you very much, Professor Milani. Dr. Momeni Azadeh.
Mamnoon, Professor Tawakkoli. Professor Milani, thank you very much for such a wonderful presentation. The thing is that actually I read your book. I thanked you before. I just wanted one more time to say thank you. It was really thought-provoking, and I really enjoyed reading it. Thank you. Professor Milani, from some social science theory, I have done some research about the identity and specifically women's identity. So there is a kind of agency and the structure, and the interaction between the agency and the structure would shape the identity. So I was wondering, when I was listening to you, I was wondering if threshold would, have the same function in the sense that there is a boundary between private sphere and the public sphere that would shape the identity. So I just wanted to ask if there's an accurate perspective or not. Thank you.
Azadeh Khanum Jan, of course it is, and thank you. This is wonderful observation, and absolutely. I think one reason, please forgive me to preface my elaboration on your wonderful comment. It's not a comment. Yours was a great, it wasn't a question, it was a comment. If you read the poetry of Rumi, of Hafez, Attar, these are master of spaces where the real and the imaginary, the inside and the outside, the emotional and the intellectual collapse, ceases to exist. Now, for women, let me also, if I can recall it correctly, Rumi has this beautiful line, دویی از خود برون کردم همه هستی یکی دیدم یکی بینم یکی جویم یکی دانم. It's a beautiful poem that once you stop seeing the world as these two extremes without denying their existence. There is an inside and there is an outside. There are walls and there are doors and there are closed doors and there are closed gates. But what he's saying is that in order to be creative, in order to become Rumi, you had to get rid of دویی از خود برون کردم. You have to get rid of this binary mode of thinking. Having said that this space, and I started with that beautiful poem of Eliot. I love that poem. And it's one of T.S. Eliot's most famous poems. I had never seen Threshold in it. Where the end and the beginning collapses. The threshold is the entrance and the exit, right? Depending on which side you're standing, you can be walking out or you can be walking in. So women in segregated countries, in patriarchal countries to a different degrees, of course, know the value, the architectural, poetic, and prosodic value of Threshold. That's a space that is both safe, but also allows you the discovery of the world. You become another Ulysses. You become Don Quixote. You become Rostam. I mean, who can you think in Iranian literature who cannot be separated from her horse, her carriage, her airplane, her car, her mode of motorized mobility? And yet we have so many examples of men.
Thank you very much, Professor Milani. Professor Dorraj.
Thank you very much, Professor Milani, for a thoughtful and heartfelt presentation. It was very touching. I have a twofold question which are related. You briefly mentioned that from the days that you wrote your dissertation on Forough Farrokhzad, in hindsight, your assessment may have changed. Could you reveal how that manifesting itself in your latest assessment of her place? But also I'm curious about her place, not just in Iranian modern literature and poetry, but also as a scholar of comparative literature globally, given how much prolific she was in a short span of time that she lived, and she was allowed to produce the very rich poetry and literature that she produced.
Thank you, Manchurjan. Wonderful question, both of them. My perception of Forough, and I can say it with some certainty because for preparing for this talk, I went back and looked at my dissertation, which was written decades ago, of course. You know, I wish I could have written it now. Manshurjan, in that dissertation, I see a lot more of myself than I see of Forough Farrokhzad. Let me explain. I present Forough as a stranger in a strange land. I mean, maybe I don't use these terms, but something very similar to that. I talk about Forough as a woman who suffered in a male-dominated society and literary tradition. I see her as a victim almost. Of a society, of a family that did not appreciate her talent. And it was through reading and rereading and rereading of her poetry that I realized I'm not doing justice to what she's telling me as one of her readers. She's refusing to see herself as a victim. At times, she presents herself as a victimizer. She refuses to accept that she never does things that are wrong. She presents herself as fallible. She presents herself as a human being, but one who is constantly striving to become a better version of herself. I didn't see those back then. It took me 4 decades to better understand her, but also to better understand myself, to appreciate the uniqueness of Farrokhzad's poetry. For me, it remains unique because it is so honest, because it is so devoid of looking for heroes. It is unique because she knows in a culture where for over thousands of years, we've been fighting to tell the truth. There is a quotation from Albert Camus that I love. It says, "Freedom is the right to tell the truth. How beautiful that is. آزادی رهایی از ضرورت دروغ گفتن است. For thousands of years, we have not been privileged with this right not to lie. گفتار نیک، پندار نیک، رفتار نیک، زoroaster. Not only that he saw the interconnectedness between what you say and what you think and what you do, but that he also put it as one of the three basic foundations of his faith, telling the truth. The Padishah Hachameneshan Dariush, who wanted his country to be saved from 3 calamities. Do you remember what they are? 3 calamities. Enemies, lies, and drought. This is everywhere. So Forough understood this in her letters, in her short stories, in her poems, repeatedly says, "Nemitavanam durugh beguyam." I cannot lie. And I mean, I have come to fully appreciate this honesty, and I think that's why she has showed me the way. She really led me to understand thresholds. It was through her poetry that I started asking, why is she, for instance, in one of her poems, in the last 5 lines of the poem, a beautiful poem called "Ba aftab sarami dobare khaham kard." She uses 4 times the word threshold. She is standing at the threshold to greet those who can stand at the threshold, those who are freed from these binary modes of thinking, good or bad, right or wrong, east or west, healthy or diseased. Her mode of thinking went beyond that. She transcended binary opposites. And her significance in the world, as someone who's been working on Forough for almost 50 years, writing, publishing. And there are many translations, some good, some, but Farrokhzad has not found her Fitzgerald yet, or a Coleman Bark. And I know many people have problem with both translators, but I also think we need someone who can help these poems transmigrate, not translate, transmigrate.
Liberate them from their cages.
Exactly. Thank you. Exactly.
Thank you, Professor Milani. Our next question comes from Ustad Zarine Bath.
Yes.
Hi, Bajat. So
Hi,
wonderful to
Bajat.
see you.
Same here. I miss you so much. And I must say, Farrokhzad is always a bestseller in my classes on gender. I think I have told you that many times when I was your colleague. And then, of course, your book that introduced us, to her and to these other historical figures. So you're always.
We miss you in Charlottesville, Bajat. We miss you.
Absolutely. Well, I will come visit. I really, really appreciate your presentation. And I was really looking forward to this. And by the way, you look younger and younger. So you look wonderful, as always, very elegant.
So one question I have, Farzaneh John, for you. I'm about to put together a reader on, on women for courses on history, a translation of primary sources. And I work on the pre-modern era, and I'm interested both on Iranian women and Ottoman, and I do comparative work. So one question I have, and I'm so glad that, you told us about how you changed your mind about Farooq, and now you think that she's not really a victim. And it's wrong to think of her as a victimized figure, because our students fall into that trap. In fact, one student recently told me, oh, it's so sad to read her poetry. I said, no, read more. And they connect to her, my female students, so amazingly at UC Riverside. So I do think she's a universal figure. And we don't really need, to even place her in an Iranian context. Women from all over the world among our students connect to her immediately. So she is a global figure, as you know. So back to the question of agency and victimhood. And one trap that we historians and those of us who work on gender have to constantly avoid is to turn women into victims in that part of the world. And to kind of, try to recover not only their agency, and I'm so glad that Azadeh John, brought that up, but also their voices that have been excluded, have been silenced. I, as a historian, have to constantly, look for it. And unfortunately, with Iran, these historical sources have not really survived. So how do you think it's best to sort of not to kind of fall into this, trap of modernity, pre-modernity, and truly, get into these projects? I'm really curious to know whether women were truly oppressed in the Qajar era in the 19th century, because we know they were so active in the Tobacco Rebellion, in the Constitutional Revolution. They were in the forefront of these movements more than women in any part of the Middle East. So what is your advice, as a kind of senior scholar to us who are, very kind of close to you, behind you, who are thinking of these projects, right, in terms of, kind of correcting the way you corrected your view of Farrokhzad, right, in our, narratives and in the kind of vocabulary we use. I love your concept of segregation, because I do tell my students that we are dealing with segregation based on gender. So we have to approach the history of women the way we approach the history of race and slavery. But at the same time, we don't want to deny them their agency historically.
Yes. Well, Farzaneh, if I had the answer to your question, it would really entitle me to a Nobel Prize. I have to say, I have been teaching courses on women, as you remember some of it, and the Middle East since 1979. I've taught courses on women and Islam. I've taught courses on border crossing women and literature in the Islamic Middle East and North Africa. Taught course on Cinderella and Barbie, women and beauty, non-Western feminism, and you name it. And the core argument usually has been that, look, yes, there are problems, but your perception of women in the Middle East is also not right. The central tenet of feminism was the agency of women. So it really helps to begin there and, to go to some of the early writings in feminism or the figures that are more familiar to them today who talk about women's agency. I mean, that's what feminism is based on, women's feminism. So I, without getting upset, without, leaving the room in frustration, I say, let's see why we can offer Western women their agency. But when it comes to other women, in other parts of the world, we immediately switch gear and we think they have zero agency. Human beings have agency, sure, different degrees, sure, they have to fight to gain more of it, but it's not an either or proposition. It's not that you either have agency or have none. I mean, one of the most fascinating for me revelation was about race segregation, when some people started talking, well, yes, even slaves had agency. Even slaves had agency. So, I think for me, and I would not dare recommend anything to you, you're such a wonderful teacher. For me, what has helped was not to get defensive about it, but to try to find local arguments, the issue of agency here. And then also, one poem, for instance, that helps my students a lot, especially when we contextualize it, is Gonah Kardan. It's a poem about adultery at a time when a woman could be stoned to death. It's only 12 lines. It's easy to read. It's easy to say, what's happening here? How is she accepting agency for loving a man? Is this a good thing or a bad thing? It's a short poem. You don't have to read, 15 pages of poetry to get to the gist of it. That in fact, in that poem, it's a man who is objectified. Not only she accepts full agency, she objectifies the man. He becomes the object of lust and the object of desire of the woman. And this reversal on so many levels in a short poem by a 20-year-old woman speaks to young students. That has been my experience. But we should talk, Faribajan.
Thank you. Outstanding response. The next question comes from Thea or T.
Thea, yes.
Thea.
Yes. Excuse me, my webcam has some problems. I can't give you my picture. I'll put my question without my appearance. First of all, thank you very much, Dr. Tavakkoli, for giving me such a great chance to see and hear Professor Milani's presentation, because I was dreaming for ages to have such an opportunity, and it was a really great gift for me to attend this presentation. That was very impressive, very informative, and I really liked the links she made. It was a very interesting point of view, how she links her own biography with the Persian literature figures. And I have too much to tell, but let me put my question. This recent years, Fariba Wafi is really mostly spoken literary figure in modern Persian literature. And how can you see her place in your context, in the context of the things you've told this presentation?
I'm sorry, who did you say?
Fariba Wafi. Fariba Wafi. Fariba Wafi.
Fariba Wafi.
Yes.
Fariba Wafi. Okay, sure. Sure. Thank you. Thank you for your kind words. They really mean a lot to me. I'm most grateful to you. I have to tell you, I love Fariba Wafi. I think her book, My Bird, Parandeh Man, is an absolute masterpiece. It is short. If I'm not mistaken, it's about 110 pages in Persian. As you might know, T dear, it has been translated into English. And Fariba Wafi has written many other books. My favorite, of course, is Parandeh Man, My Bird. But her other books are equally unusual, exceptional. Fariba Wafi comes from, does not come from Tehran, although she now lives in Tehran. She does not come from a family of writers and artists, and she had different jobs. She had to work and write, and I admire what she has done, what she has brought to Persian literature. I think My Bird is not just prose. Pages of it actually reads like poetry. So I love Fariba Wafi. Thank you for mentioning her name. And I would highly recommend her to anyone who is interested in post-revolutionary writing in Iran. She has won quite a few prestigious awards, well-deserved. And I hope we will have the good honor to have her come back to the US.
Thank you very much. Another novel of her, Badas Payan, after the final.
Yes.
I think it's very interesting with her. It's three different female heroes with their own lives and dreams and reality. It's really not bad. And it is translated in Georgian. That is the first translation of this novel in the world.
Translated into Georgian language?
Yes.
Oh, I'm going to Tbilisi in 2 weeks. Who translated it?
So interesting. So have my email and telephone, and I would like to meet you if it's possible. And
I would love that. I'm coming there. I will be there on the 24th. So please send me your email or telephone number. I would love to meet you.
Okay, I'll send it through dear Mr. Tavakoli if it's.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you.
I will definitely send it to you, Professor Milani. Professor Milani, we have Dr. Bakhtiyar Sajjadi, who is thanking you for your inventive notions, but he also has a sort of cautionary note indicating that Professor Milani used the term Iranian literature several times in her lecture. I think it's better to employ the term Persian literature, in that there are Azeri, Kurdish, Baluchi, and even Arabic literature in Iran, most of which are still unknown to common researchers.
Okay. Point well taken. Thank you, sir.
Very good. And then Mehri Honarbin. Are you there?
Well, it's taking so long that
Mehri Honarbin wants to know how to find your book on Forough Farrokhzad's letters.
on Furugh Farrokhzad letters. Yes, that was part of the biography. There are over 30 letters published in that book for the first time. 15 of them letters of Furugh Farrokhzad to Mr. Golestan, a few to her father that, although it has not attracted as much attention as the letters to Mr. Golestan, I find them absolutely fascinating, important in better understanding Farrokhzad's life and poetry. It is, unfortunately, it might not be very easy to find that book. The book has not been translated into English, and I'm ashamed of that. People have been very kind, calling me, writing articles that translate this book, and I haven't had the time, the privilege to do it. I would love to do it at some point. I don't think I'll have the time, but if you send me, if you send Professor Tawakkoli your address, I will be happy to send you a copy of that book if you read Persian. I'll be happy to mail you one.
Very good. Thank you. Professor Milani, you have spoken and you have responded to questions for 30 minutes over the allocated time. Thank you. I know you are traveling and you have a very, very, very busy schedule. I am truly grateful for your original, outstanding, and thoughtful retrospective, something that really inspires a lot of our younger colleagues. Thank you again for accepting our invitation and for giving such a brilliant presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It was wonderful. I loved seeing everyone. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Khoda nigahdar. Bye-bye.